At the start of Poetry Africa tour, Uncle Frank gave us a challenge of writing some erotica. Now, don't y'all parents get nervous now. This is very tastefully done. I'm a 60-year-old woman, and this is my first erotic poem, but in the writing, it became more than that. And I dedicate this to my husband of 41 years, Brother Pete O'Neill. Red Cockatoo Feathers. She knew that her time was fast approaching. The disease had spread too far, and doctors gave her no hope. They sent her home to live out her last months, weeks, days. But she was happy and content and was blessed that she could control the time and manner of her transition. She had swallowed the full bottle of pills, the tiny pink ones that would help her to sail on out of her life on a gentle note. And her last cup of honey sweet jasmine tea had been drunk. She takes out her brightly painted little treasure chest box full of her best herbal remedy and chocolate-flavored Rizla papers. And she rolls the last of the giant-sized spliffs that had been such a comfort and ease for the pains that had racked her body for the last 6 months. And she lights up, inhales, and heads for the joy of her garden filled with veggies and flowers and stones and herbs. She sits on the stone bench slab, relishing the coldness of the hard surface against her uncovered, panty-less mound. She had stopped wearing the thick cotton panties she'd favored since she was a little girl, after attending a women's sexuality retreat more than 40 years ago somewhere up in the mountains of upstate New York, where she'd learned so many new things about her woman's self, including the fact that her down there needed to be able to breathe and feel the sunshine and wind on a regular basis. And that's when she'd also discovered the joy of waxing her polished hardwood floors on her hands and knees, with the double glass kitchen doors thrown wide open and her thick cotton panties thrown in a corner, to feel the wild licks of wind on her unfurled, uncovered mound. And now she sat and smoked and felt the pills start to take her, and she knew her time was near. Everything was magnified, each memory, each smell, each sound, and she isolated that tap, tap, tapping sound of the water fountain she had found at the flea market, a sound that always took her back to memories of a red-tailed cockatoo tapping at her window nearly 70 years before, and she smiled. She pulled out the red cockatoo feathers that she loved to tuck into the crown of her locks and stroke them and smelled them, as she had continued to do every day since she was 9 years old and discovered the offering of feathers on her windowsill. She shivered and felt her now thinned and loosely wrinkled skin grow spotted with goosebumps of pleasure at her childhood memory of the sound that had caught her attention one morning during what had become her daily ritual of gentle, tentative, clumsy-fingered explorations of that part of herself she had learned was named down there. As a young girl, she had gotten pleasure from hiding among the tall flowers and ferns and bushes in the garden while eavesdropping on the conversations of her mother and her lady friends as they sat around wrought iron glass-covered tables, smoking and drinking homemade elderberry wine and listening to down-home Delta blues music. They'd lower their voices, but continue to laugh out loud when they spot her crouching among the tall pink zinnias, trying to hear and understand what the secret conversations were about. So all she could barely decipher were half-heard words and whispers like, down there. Yeah, girl. What? Sure enough, I ain't lying. Down there. Girl, no, he didn't. Yeah, girl. Yes, he did. It was only later that her cousin visiting from Michigan schooled her, and she finally was clear of where down there actually was. The why of it was unspoken, and not really all the way understandable to her, but somehow she had learned to feel a little apprehensive and deliciously guilty about touching that part of her newly discovered self. And she always made sure that the door was locked before she laid down to get to it. Somehow, over the years, she had developed a propensity for the forbidden, and she reveled in the taboo. She even loved the way that 5-letter word rolled around inside her mouth and the hot cinnamon taste of the sound that always started a tingling vibration that began in the middle of her tongue, traveling the meridians of her core to land smack dab in the middle of that part of herself she had continued to call her down there. She caught her breath when she got up from the now warm stone bench in the garden, dizzy from the pills that were rapidly doing her bidding. And she knew it was time to go and lay down in her bed with her memories and her feathers. She didn't want them to discover her body in an untidy heap in the garden. She wanted to be found with her feathers in the middle of the bed in her room, in the house she had grown up in, been married in, birthed her 4 children in, held the wake for her mother in, wiped the dribble from her Alzheimer's afflicted father lips in, fled the rage of her drugged out husband in, and now the house that she would herself lay down by choice and die in. And she smiled wide and licked her lips at the precious little girl memory of that red-tailed cockatoo that had tapped seemingly, urgently at the glass pane of her window. She had watched it from the bed of her daily ritual explorations as it dipped its wet, red beak repeatedly into the tufts of its feathers, wetting the beak with its black, sharply pointed tongue, dipping its head as it pulled each feather through the beak, wetted it and pulled, wetted and pulled, wetted and pulled. And then the bird stopped suddenly and looked her square in her face. And it winked and it smiled at her. It actually smiled. And that smile and that wink had pulled her into another state of being, a magical place whose recollection became her periodic refuge throughout her long life. They had stared at each other, the little girl and the gray and white red-tailed cockatoo, eyeball to eyeball. And they exchanged somehow the essence of their spirits. She became that red, shiny beak. She became that scaly, black, pointed tongue. She became the malleable armature of those damp and slickened gray and white feathers. And she dipped her fingers into her own downy feathers nested in her down there, and she wetted and pulled and pulled and wetted and pulled, echoing the accelerating rhythm of the red-tailed cockatoo, and it bobbed its head quicker and faster, and she could feel its mounting, swelling excitement, and it bobbed and dipped and wetted and pulled, and it became her life totem in that instant, her familiar. And she held on to its 3 red tail feathers as they flew to their destination together, panting and preening and dipping and pulling. And she let loose her first scream of ecstasy as she fell from the sky with the 3 red tail feathers gripped firmly in her trembling fingers. When she opened her eyes and fondly caught her astonished breath, the bird was gone, but the 3 red tail feathers, evidence of her trip into another world, lay in a neat little pile on the white painted windowsill. She unlocked and raised the window and stuck her head out into the morning breeze and looked this way and that, but the bird was gone. She took up the red feathers and kissed them and gently licked the still warm gift that was her blessing. And she buried her nose into the faintly reptilian smell left behind. The woman who was that little girl blinked and smiled with the still precious memory through the veil of mist that had now started to rapidly surround her. And she knew that her time had arrived. The light at the end of the tunnel that she'd always heard about was rapidly enveloping her, and she lays down squarely in the middle of her bed. She tucks the blessing of her 3 red tail feathers gently into the damp moisture of her now sparse and fully gray down-covered mound. And she sighs in contentment and locks the door behind her for the very last time. Yeah. It's all good, y'all. Santini.